Are you a crappy partner, crappy wife, crappy husband, crappy mate? This podcast is for you. Give yourself the gift of self-awareness. Learn new skills. Take the time to assess your partnership, marriage, relationship, etc. So how are we going to do this? Start by taking the Crappy Mate quiz. The quiz can be found on our website, www.crappymate.com, on Pinterest, Crappy Mate, Instagram and Facebook, Crappy Mate Podcast. We will dedicate episodes to discussing the quiz topics. In further episodes, we will be exploring common problems, speed bumps that occur in relationships. Also, we will introduce time-tested skills and helpful hints to enhance your relationship, and we invite you, our listeners, to contribute your thoughts, questions, or concerns regarding relationships. Welcome to the Crappy Mate Podcast. I'm Dr. Richard Vance Barnes, MD. I'm a board-certified general psychiatrist with 25 plus years in psychiatry. I have treated patients in a variety of settings, both inpatient units, outpatient units, partial hospitalization units, as well as detoxification programs and rehabilitation programs. And I've had a private practice for many, many years.
And I'm Barbara Quaid, a marriage and family therapist. I also have over 25 years experience working with families, individuals, and couples. And my life as a therapist has been both humbling and joyful. Before we get started, I'd just like to talk about our disclaimer. The Crappy Mate podcast is designed to be a useful tool to help individuals and couples have happier and healthier relationships. This podcast is not a substitute for individual or couples therapy, and as always, relationships need to be safe. Seek professional help as needed.
The Crappy Mate podcast was developed out of hearing years and years of stories and accounts from patients in therapy about their mates and themselves actually being crappy mates and poorly behaving within the relationship. And so this concept was then developed into a podcast of how can we help people to actually improve upon their relationships.
And so in order to do this, we developed a quiz. And the quiz, we really thought about some concepts that we thought were important in a relationship. And so the Crappy Mate quiz ended up being a 10-question self-scoring assessment that can be found on our Facebook page. And our Facebook page is aptly named the Crappy Mate Podcast. And along with the quiz, you will find a glossary with the terms we used both in the podcast and on the quiz. And this is so we can all be on the same page. Now, to score the quiz, you will read each question carefully and then ask yourself, do I do this almost always, sometimes, or almost never? And when we thought about this, the scoring is like this. Almost always is worth 3 points, sometimes 2 points, and almost never 1 point. So once you have your total points, you add them up. And a score of 10 to 17 clearly indicates that one needs improvement. A score of 17 to 24, one has a degree of awareness, but improvement can still be beneficial. And a score of 24 to 30, one is aware, insightful, and acting in a positive manner as it pertains to the relationship.
Well, welcome to the Crappy Mate Podcast today. Today we wanted to talk about a really important topic, I believe, in subject area, and that is, what is it like to live with someone, a partner, significant other, husband, wife, spouse, etc., who may be suffering from a depression. And I think this will be a 2-part series because it is so important, Barbara, that we talk about this subject area. And I think that it'll touch a lot of people. I know that I've had to live with people that have had depression in their lives and what that feels like. And so I think it's really important that we get into this subject area today and discuss what is it like to live with your significant other whom may be suffering from depression.
So let's let our listeners know how we're going to divide this up. I think this first episode we'll be talking about the symptoms that you see in your partner who is suffering from depression. And in the second episode, we'll really be talking about skill sets that you would need and how you would deal with the person you're living with.
I think that is a wonderful way to break this down, this very important topic. And so just briefly, let's define, without going into the diagnostic specifics for depression, I'll just simply discuss how I see depression and how I really tell my patients when I'm in session with them what to look for and what does it look like. So simply, in my mind, depression is having this lack of interest and a lack of desire to do things that you, at one point, really felt very good about and felt great joy in. And another aspect of this depression, and I explain this to my patients, is that people will have a depressed mood for most of the day, most of the time, again, for really just a period of 2 weeks. And the lack of interest in things that you found pleasurable as well is for a period of about 2 weeks. Now, there are other symptoms that go with depression that are telltale for depression signs. And these are the signs that I think that our partners, our mates, our significant others will quite often notice within us while we are actually involved in the depression, as an individual. So things like having a decreased appetite is one thing that we would see, or a increased appetite. Having decreased energy, where people are sleeping all the time, or they're feeling fatigued most of the time. Quite often there's a decrease in libido, and there's not much of a sex drive for most people. And obviously as partners, and if we're engaged in an intimate sexual relationship with them, we will definitely notice that there's not an interest in that form of intimacy. So people will also have an excessive amount of sleeping, or they won't sleep quite as much as they should. There's decreases in socialization, and socialization in terms of not only getting together with friends, but also with family members, where people are not wanting to share time with their loved ones in that sense. So, and there are other things that happen during a depression that our mates will quite often notice in us, like personal hygiene and the lack of personal hygiene. People will maybe stay in their same clothes for several days at a time, or they won't shower for several days at a time. And the other aspects that I would say people really do need to notice and to be aware of are some of the more serious feelings where people are talking about dying, or they're talking about how the future doesn't look so bright and they don't have any future plans. And so for me, as a psychiatrist, the whole notion of hopelessness is very, very important in identifying that in people that are depressed, because hopelessness, in my opinion, will quite often lead to thoughts of suicide and people dying.
So let's just give an example, and I'm thinking of some examples that I have had as a therapist. So I know one person, or it could be anybody actually, who comes home from work. First thing they do is they've purchased some fast food. They've eaten the fast food. It's not healthy food. It's probably greasy, not healthy for them. They eat it, kind of throw the trash on the side. This person doesn't take out her trash. She has trash built up for weeks at a time. And then, of course, she's doing that oversleeping. In her case, it's oversleeping. So she goes to bed right away. May not sleep through the night, may wake up in the middle of the night. So it's undersleeping as well. It's oversleeping and undersleeping all at the same time. Tired every day, doesn't like work, doesn't have friends, or doesn't call her friends. And then there's maybe an increase in alcohol or substance abuse, so needing to have a drink at night just to wind down or something of that sort. And in this case, the family dynamics are difficult. She's fighting with family members, not liking what they have to say to her. this kind of thing.
Those are really common examples of some of the aspects that we see in depressed people quite often. The overeating, the oversleeping, the lack of self-care. There's a disturbance quite often in how we're relating to other people. So those are all really key aspects to that. I have to share with you and our listeners some personal examples of some of this, and having watched depression in partners that I've been with and mates that I've been with. And quite often what I've noticed is that there is this almost self-centeredness that happens where people really kind of tuck into themselves, and the world around them is not really so much to be noticed. And so it'll look like, yes, I made dinner, but I didn't really eat it, and I didn't really leave dinner for you. I would come home during some of these relationships, and I would notice how things were not put away, and clothes were left scattered all through rooms. And I would also comment about, when is the last time that you actually took a shower? And so that this personal care and the hygiene will often suffer as well. But there's this lack of really understanding that, or there's this lack of really being able to appreciate that this is impacting other people around me. And so I think there is some self-centeredness that happens with a depressive condition. And we notice that as partners. We notice that we're being shut out and we're being kind of left on the sideline as we are watching this train go down the tracks.
Yeah, I think that what you're describing are very typical symptoms and behaviors. And what I notice is that the person in a depressive episode has lost their sense of schedule, whereby a person that's really healthy will have a schedule, get up every day at the same time approximately, will eat at designated times usually, and then go to bed, have maybe an exercise program or whatever it is that they do, but it's scheduled. And it seems like with depression, there is a loss of that scheduling. So sleep is disturbed, eating is disturbed, all these normal activities are really disturbed.
I think you're making a great point, and that is there's a disruption in the order of their lives. And that's the thing that we will quite often notice, that, hey, things are kind of scattered. They're not making a lot of sense. Why was this left out? Or why are the clothes in such disarray after they've just been washed? I mean, so it's the features in terms of how people take care of themselves and how they take care of their lives is what we notice quite often as partners. We are watching them not have that organization for their lives. And that's an important point to make, because sometimes we don't know if people are really depressed, but we can watch and see how they're taking care of themselves and what they're doing with their lives that will tell us quite often that they are depressed. And people that are suffering from depression, sometimes they don't realize that. They don't realize that they're off track, that things are not making a lot of sense to others that are watching them. And I think that what happens quite often with depression, too, is there's this lack of awareness because we're so overly concerned with how badly we're feeling. And so the depressed moods, this lack of interest in the things that we once found enjoyable or pleasurable, becomes to the forefront, and it becomes the major thing that we focus on when we're depressed.
Just piggybacking on our last episode, when we defined mental illness, we said it was changes in mood, behavior, and or thoughts. And this is really what we're noticing with our partner. We're noticing different behaviors that we might not see that are typical for this person. We're noticing changes in mood, and we're noticing changes in thoughts. And that's how we learn about their thoughts, through what they talk about. You know, like maybe everything is just gloomy or nothing's going well in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is by way of their communication, but sometimes they're not communicating at all. And that, too, is a sign that something can be terribly wrong. And for me, as a psychiatrist, one of the key aspects that I always look for in people that are depressed is, do they have any hope? Are they at the point of sheer hopelessness? And hopelessness to me is a really important sign that tells me that people are feeling that it's never going to get better, that things are never going to change. And that's a very, very dangerous place to be in when you're watching someone whom is depressed. And so we always want to kind of tease that out. Are they at that point of utter hopelessness? Because if they are, then that's a really important sign to address and to watch out for, because that may lead to something more serious like suicidal behavior.
Well, and how do we look at that? We see if they're speaking about nothing's good in the world, or they're talking about dying, or they're doing behaviors such as giving things away. These are all really important activities or behaviors that are concerning.
Yes, they are very concerning, and because we love them, we love our partners, we have to be aware of those, and we have to be on guard to watch out for those and to make sure that people aren't going in that direction, or at least we're not allowing them to go without talking about it. We have to be able to talk about it. And people are quite often, I think they do have the misconception that if we talk about suicide, people will then become suicidal. No, and in fact, in my clinical experience, is that we want to flush that out. We want to make sure people are not going to that place of suicidality and suicidal thinking, because that's a very lonely place. And that's a place where quite often people can get into serious trouble because they're there, and they're there by themselves because they're not talking about it.
Yeah, it's a little bit like a pressure cooker. They've thought about it, or they've thought about their hopelessness, or they've had suicidal ideation, but it's all internal. And so talking about it is really like releasing that valve and letting off some of the steam. And you're right. People really believe that if you talk about or ask about suicide ideation, that it's going to put that into their head. And believe me, these thoughts are already in their heads if they're there.
And that's what I would say, too, is that these thoughts are probably there, especially if you can gather and understand that there's these thoughts and feelings of hopelessness. Because hopelessness, in my opinion, is one of the key signs that tell you people are in serious trouble. So with that, I think that we want to maybe close today's podcast with just some helpful hints regarding recognizing the depression perhaps in our mates and our partners, etc., and what can we do about that. And the second part to this series, we will be exploring further what we do as partners and how do we handle living with someone who does have a depression.
So our helpful hints today, and we're really going to elaborate on this in the next episode, but is to just find out about depression. Do some research. And then remember that there's help out there. And one of the best help you can do is NAMI, and that's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. You can reach them at nami.org. They have lots of resources to help you find out about mental illness and in particular depression.
Okay, well, thank you for that, Barbara, today. And as we mentioned, we'll be continuing this topic further as we explore ways for partners from a behavioral and emotional standpoint deal with and help those that are suffering from depression that they're living with. So thank you for our listeners today tuning in. And as always, feel free to write suggestions and give us comments in regards to our podcast. Thank you for listening to the Crappy Mate podcast today. In closing the podcast today, I just want to remind our listeners of our disclaimer. The Crappy Mate podcast is designed to be a useful tool to help individuals and couples have happier and healthier relationships. This podcast is not a substitute for individual or couples therapy. And as always, relationships need to be safe. Seek professional help as needed.
Thank you for listening to the Crappy Mate podcast. We invite you to submit comments, questions, and/or concerns about today's podcast, or give us feedback on relationship topics you'd like to hear covered. We encourage you to try our helpful hints. Give these a go, Try them on for size. Remember, you can follow us on our Facebook and Instagram pages under the Crappy Mate Podcast. Our website is www.crappymate.com. And please be sure to subscribe. Thank you for listening.